Well, so dear friends, dear colleagues, thank you for this opportunity to present myself here as a moderator year in and out. For me, this is the 6th annual Economic Year Forum. We have always had lots of interesting topics to moderate. However, today I'm honored to moderate a highly difficult but so badly needed topic for our country, European integration and possible consequences, as well as securing our economic interests after the economic integration of Ukraine to the EU. I am Mikhaila Bednurian, specialist in trade, head of the European Integration Committee at the Federation of Employers of Ukraine, and we deal a lot with bilateral trade and trade with the EU in particular. Today we have fascinating speakers, very multifaceted. We have both the representatives of the state and business, and naturally we also have a chief of the delegation, European Union ambassador to Ukraine. So let us get it underway. Let me introduce our speakers first. Alexander Ilkov, head of the Chief Executive Office of Metinvest Group, Ms. Katerina Maternova, European Union Ambassador to Ukraine, Yevgen Osipov, CEO of Kernel, Serhiy Tkachuk, acting head of the State Service of Ukraine on Food Security and Consumer Protection. We have with us 3 business companies, and we suppose that about 150,000 employees work for this company. They have more than $80 billion in return. So Yuri Melnik, Deputy Executive Director and Sustainable Development Director of MHP, Yevgeny Osipov, as I have already introduced, Chief Executive Officer of Kernel Company, and Alexander Vodovizh, head of Metinvest Group. So we will be speaking about the role of the government in preserving our economic possibility for the country, the challenges for businesses, and the homework for both the government and the business, how to mitigate losses and to maximize and capitalize on everything that comes your way, every opportunity. We will have 3 blocks of questions, and if we have some time left, which is hardly manageable for us to do, still we will enable a Q&A session. But time is really short. We only have 1 hour, 10 minutes available. So let's begin. For a warm-up, let me share a slight illustration of certain consequences as a result of European integration for the economies of European countries, the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. After they entered the EU, the share of the GDP of these countries declined sharply. For example, in Latvia, that declined by 15% in the first 3 years of membership, and in Lithuania by 10% in the same 3 years. Once again, it was because sugar industry, machinery building, unfortunately, couldn't resist rivalry in the EU. Poland, for example, their GDP also declined 20% 10 years of their membership in the EU, once again because they had to comply with the different environmental standards, which resulted in the decline in manufacturing. Hungary, also when they became a member of the EU, their GDP declined 12% in the first 7 years. Romania, the share of agriculture and other types of industry declined nearly 18% due to restrictions on manufacturing, for example, in dairy production and in steel industry. Poland and Bulgaria, their agrarian production also declined by 20% in dairy business in Poland, and agrarian companies had to suffer from the reduction of subsidies. When we talk about Hungary energy sector, they had to close their thermal power plant, which unfortunately increased the dependency of this country on importing energy. In Greece, for example, 6 years into membership, then in Portugal, the number of people working in textiles, 60% of people unfortunately lost their jobs. Estonia had to reduce fishing 10%, sugar production in Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. They had to suspend the production of sugar making due to quotas imposed on them on the EU that unfortunately had an adverse effect on employment and business production. So these are realistic examples. This is for you to understand the consequences of what Ukraine and Ukrainian businesses may suffer from after they enter the European Union. So we have a representative of mining industry, meat processing, and an agrarian and grain producer, as well as oil manufacturer as members of our panelists. So let's just start with Alexander Ilkov. How to thwart, how to prevent the effects that in a couple of years after the accession, we will suffer from the same story in the main industries of our economy. Once again, 12% within the GDP of the whole country or the whole company. Good afternoon, dear friends. First of all, I'm delighted to be a panelist during this event. Within the government, for a long time, a decision was taken a long time ago that our Euro integration process and negotiations with the EU is not just a matter of foreign policy making and being engaged in a dialogue with our partners, but it's also to do with our internal policy making, because we realize that this policy, this dialogue that we are engaged in with business within the framework of EU accession is no less important, because from our conviction, businesses are main stakeholders, whether they are going to be beneficiaries or are going to become victims of this process. Well, in your introduction, you have already implied that. So during this discussion, let us look into this in greater detail. However, when talking about the strategy of the government within this negotiation process, we come from the fact that EU accession, no matter how lofty this may sound, is an existential choice of the nation of Ukraine, already enshrined in the Constitution of Ukraine. So we are definitely moving along these lines. And at one point, our Vice Prime Minister on European Euro-Atlantic integration and the chief negotiator on behalf of Ukraine in this negotiation process once put it, this locomotive has already left the platform, it's already going, it's on the way, and there are only two options. Either we are on it, or this locomotive will be hitting and killing everyone that it'll find in its way. I may also exaggerate, but nevertheless. When we talk about the negotiations process, we have to be aware of the fact that, first of all, it's a bilateral process. When talking about negotiations with the EU, it's a multilateral process at that. Because during this stage, it also requires unanimous agreement provided by all of the member states for a new country to join the EU. So it means that we will have to go through these negotiations and make sure that 27 member states of the European Union will have to give us their consent for joining the EU. Therefore, when we talk about pursuing the national interests of Ukraine, one must be conscious of the fact that in addition to the national interests of Ukraine, there are also national interests of every member state of the EU. And this is also a defining role that has to play in the negotiations process, which is already ongoing and will take place in the future. If we are speaking about the key characteristic of this process, and I suppose that Madam Katerina will definitely speak about that in her intervention, to a great extent, when we talk about negotiations and joining the EU, negotiations in many ways is also one of the ways which is absolutely indispensable for us to go through this negotiation. For Ukraine, Ukraine has taken the commitment to implement all of the legislation of the EU, and it goes without questions. If we are to join the EU, it means that we are to join the single market. It means that we get committed to implementing the legislation of the EU in fullness, something that will provide for the free movement of trade, goods, employees, industry, and we commit all of the standards which persist in the European Union. So we are not even to negotiate about that. So what are the negotiations about? They be conducted concerning two things exclusively, about the transition period and some departures from that. So this is the key position that will be pursued during the whole negotiations period, and all of the strategies need to revolve around that. That work is already underway because right now we are moving on through the technical, which is an extremely important thing. We're getting the Ukrainian national legislation screened. So right now we are having meetings on each of the 35 negotiation sections, where Ukraine is to introduce its level of compliance with the legislation of the EU. And on the basis of that, we will be issued with the screening reports together with the recommendations for the future. Along with that, within the framework of screening, the Ukrainian side is questioned about two things: whether you agree with the recommendations provided, and the answer should be clearly yes. Whether you will also go into departures from that, and clearly all of these things will encompass different economic issues, and whether Ukraine is interested in speeding up the integration, integrating into different tools of the EU. So basically around these three things, all of the main part of the negotiations will be circling around, and the strategy of the government will be based on that. Thank you very much. And let me clarify one thing. The European Union, from your perspective, is it ready to provide us with certain delays on certain commitments that Ukraine has assumed that will allow us not to suffer from the consequences for the economy of our country that I have already mentioned in my introductory speech? Like I have said, this is an intrinsic part of the negotiations process. And basically, we already have certain amount of analytics conducted, and our partners, our counterparts in the EU, have already discussed and analyzed these departures that the other countries have already referred to. They have identified the industries where these departures and deviations are most common. And most of the time, this is to do with delays on different kinds of parasites with potato crops, or about the cages for chicken in battery chicken farming. So some practical things, you know. Thank you, Alexander. Now I would like to move on to Madam Ambassador of the European Union to Ukraine, Madam Katarina Maternova. Can you kindly tell us, can the Ukrainian business during these negotiations count on the possibility that some of these requirements, when we talk about structural reconstruction, especially now that the country is in the midst of war, can we count as a country on certain concessions on behalf of the EU to make sure that we enter the EU as swiftly and as smoothly as we can? 5 minutes, 4 minutes. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation extended to participate.
Question, just to make sure that I understand, because your translation system is disturbed here. So
I will repeat.
If you could do that.
Yeah. So Alexander was talking about that the most important thing regarding negotiations is that getting some time framework that is given by
transition
period for very specific items for economy, for demands for European legislation and standards. So my question is very simple and maybe very difficult. Can we expect that the European Union and the European Commission during the negotiation period with the European stakeholders can give and provide for Ukrainian business some quite enough transition period not to get into EU market with a huge turbulence, especially taking into consideration today's war and the huge risks and problems that Ukrainian business face at this time?
Well, look, let me unpack that question a little bit in answering. You mentioned in your first introduction, you went through the loss of businesses in the countries that acceded to the EU more recently and what it meant for their economy. Those statistics are true. Those statistics are valid. There is no question that there were whole sectors and businesses in our countries that, and to use the technical term, didn't withstand the competitive pressure of the internal market. But giving just those statistics is only one side of the ledger, because on the other side of the ledger, you need to look at the incredible opportunities that those countries and businesses in it got from access to the internal market, the supply chains that came with being part of the whole sectors of the Western European economies, and the GDP growth that the whole countries benefited from when the enlargement happened. To take my country of Slovakia, we were growing, 6-7% a year after entry into the EU. So there is, I think that statistics are always good, but when they are put into context. And I think that was very much different time, different global situation, and also very different situation of the Ukrainian economy. First of all, you have a deep and comprehensive free trade area, and you are already, unfortunately, thanks to the brutal Russian aggression, but the EU opened its market to your products. You are exporting tariff-free to the EU. And so your industry, your services are already confronted with the competition, and you are a large market in itself. None of the small countries that you mentioned were actually interesting as markets for export. So I think that the situation in the case of Ukraine is much more nuanced. There's no question that there are going to be sectors or specific industries or specific businesses that are going to be negatively affected. I'm not trying to say that, but the biggest challenges that you were mentioning were related to the area of environment, ecology, and sort of the old style businesses, which, in all honesty, have been destroyed in Ukraine. I mean, you are the devastation of the Russian aggression. There is a silver lining that the recovery will have to be green and will have to be modern. So you're going to leapfrog in the recovery through some of the old style industries that were present in the countries that acceded to the EU in 2004 due to the communist legacy. You already are 20, 30 years behind that, in a different situation. So I think that the situation is going to be different. Yes, we will be, of course, offering transition periods. It will depend on specific type of areas, but certainly the whole area of environment, for example, and the damage that has been caused by the war will be taken into account. But I think that there are two most important aspects I would mention, and I know I'm speaking long. One is to use the time now, before the actual accession, to be retooling and to be adopting the standards that exist in the EU, because those are very high. And once you meet the EU industrial, etc. product standards, you can export anywhere in the world. I mean, there's nothing more complicated than EU rules. So that gives you, in a sense, an advantage to prepare for it before accession. And the second point, once the war is over and the foreign investment will flow, that's how all of the industries actually adapted to European and global standards, that were able to be part of the supply chains and of the big international conglomerates, etc. So I think that will come. but that will unfortunately happen when the war is over.
We will be faster than Slovak in negotiation. What do you think?
Well, the Latvia, Lithuania, and Slovakia did the negotiations in 3 years. You already are 1 year in, so yeah, I think I am not sure whether faster, but as fast, I think so.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this positive perspective. Я хочу дякую.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador, for this positive anticipation that you have just provided us with in terms of anticipations. I was specific in my providing statistics when shrinking economy was illustrated. However, the main idea is for us to understand how this process will run. Sergei Tkachuk, the chief of the State Consumption Service of Ukraine, we have specifically invited you today because, as I know it, and everyone does, Ukraine requires about different 30 acts of the EU to get approximated to our legislation. It's about 10% of the overall number of different acts that Ukraine needs to approve of in order to comply with the full scope of the standards of the EU. That is, you will have to deal with 1/10 of everything that Ukraine has committed to. How do you appreciate all of these perspectives? Are we going to be fast enough? Will we comply with all of our commitments? And in terms of delay, deferment, how critical is it for us? Good afternoon, dear colleagues, friends, businesses. Thank you very much for the invitation. Extended to me a highly relevant and hot topic. Concerning statistics and counting percentages, this is a debatable issue because in part of the legal acts, perhaps maybe this is so, although we have some legal acts in force implemented in order to comply with the requirements and directives of the EU, but they also require a great number of bylaws, different kinds of orders to be issued by the Cabinet of Ministers, etc. One thing I can tell you for sure, in terms of implementing all of the sections, Section 12 in particular, concerning the agrarian sector, veterinary and sanitary sector, it's the lengthiest, and it comprises 1/5 of the whole homework that Ukraine will have to do. That's why we have some laws to implement the requirements of the EU that are being revised again, the law on the veterinarian requirements. And I'm sure that together with the Parliament of Ukraine, the Cabinet of Ministers, and the line ministries, we will definitely comply with all of the requirements on our homework. But in addition to this implementation, we also have to make sure that all of these norms will definitely be enacted, and that means that businesses have to be fully prepared to comply with all of these requirements. They have to be fully aware of what is required of them. They need to know all of these things. Let me cite some of the practical things that have already become part of our legislation, and sometime after the martial law gets lifted, all of this will definitely be enacted. For example, in terms of pesticides, there's no procedure in place nowadays as it was in the past. However, a new procedure hasn't been enacted yet. And it's also a challenge for the whole country, for business, with reference to how they can proceed right now. So all of these things also need to be accounted for. Our service is responsible for the implementation of the requirements in 18 sectors. Regarding the control, oversight, and implementation. There's a veto block, veterinarian sanctions, many other things. In fact, there is not a single citizen who, in one way or another, is faced with the factual implementation of the functions of our associates, because we, the State Service of Ukraine on Food Security and Consumer Protection, exercise the greatest authority and get attached to a multiple number of sectors of economy. So together with our lawmakers, we need to develop all of the necessary things to implement the necessary legislation. This is super important. The homework in terms of opening up new markets, that's something that we are dealing with. 220 markets have to open up, and we are engaged in this task on a daily basis. But how can these norms be enacted? For example, a Ukrainian business at the time when all of the implemented acts get in effect, will such Ukrainian businesses be able to work if they cannot sell their production in Ukraine and in the EU? Of course, the EU is not our greatest trade partner for Ukraine in terms of selling food or agrarian production. So such a business, will it be able to work in line with all of the legal requirements? We have to ensure that. We need to preserve the possibility for such businesses to export to third world countries, according to the protocols which have been signed by Ukraine with those countries. And such practical nuances are such a lot concerning how we are supposed to implement that, because you see, every country implements this legislation differently. Now that we are going through the EU screening, this technical work that has already been alluded to by my colleagues, we need to pursue our own pathway to ensure that businesses can be preserved. Only in this form of communication can we achieve that, can we find this optimum road for businesses to survive, and they have to get ready for such implementations. Thank you very much for raising one more thing concerning how we can count. It may be 8% overall, but if we look at the whole function of the state service of Ukraine for food safety and consumer protection, so the share of your obligation is so much bigger. Yes, Section 12 is the largest in all of the scope of things. This relates not only to us, but to the Ministry of Agrarian Industry. On a 100% scale, how much homework has already been done of all of the commitments that Ukraine has already taken on? You're asking concerning the implementation of legislation. Well, we have already overcome a 50% barrier, but in how much have we implemented that with the Ukrainian business? Well, very little indeed. Why? When communicating with entrepreneurs, importers, businessmen, even when we do not speak about food production or food processing, a lot of industrialists don't even know that new technical regulations are being approved, and the Cabinet of Ministers is improving lots of requirements concerning the design of boilers, for instance. Our businesses are in the dark about them, about the acts that have already been approved, that will come into effect after the martial law is lifted. This knowledge is not there. Businesses are not tracking this information. Some of them are, but not too many. So I would delineate the implementation of the legislation and enactment of that, because all that requires massive amounts of money to be invested in, because our service, in order to ensure laboratory control and oversight, our laboratories need most contemporary state-of-art equipment, and this is very expensive for Ukraine's government. All right, thank you very much. We got your idea, Serhiy, and now we are on to the Ukrainian producers. And with that, I would like to open up our economic block and give the floor to Yuri Melnik. So, Mr. Yuri, do you agree that business more often than not simply is not aware of the homework that they need to do? And secondly, MHP is the leader in poultry production in Ukraine. And as we know, your company is also the first in the European Union in terms of poultry production. How much do we comply with the EU requirements, and what homework do you think, from the perspective of business, do we have to do in order to make sure that both Ukraine and Ukraine's businesses can integrate as smoothly as they can into the space of the EU? I see. Thank you for the question. Keep the mic closer. What Serhiy has just said, he has just said there are some sectors in business who are not keeping track of the changes of different legislation. Probably such businesses are there, although I'm not aware of such ones. Concerning our sector, which is food production, animal growing, we are keeping track of all of the changes taking place, not only in Ukraine, but also in the legal acts and amendments to that in the EU. And Definitely, we are preparing ourselves as the whole sector and as the company to be fully compliant with all of the requirements that persist in the EU, particularly in the agrarian sector and the animal farming sector in particular, because from my perspective, it is one of the most complicated, because it is to do with food production. Therefore, they have the greatest number of acts, as Mr. Sergei has just spoken about that. But we keep track of that, I assure you. And together with the government and the parliament, we are working on the development and elaboration of the necessary legislation. And the teams of our business associations keep track of all of these things. That's for sure. Regarding our readiness as of now, we are not fully prepared yet. However, once again, we need to keep close watch of what's happening with the legislation in the EU. But as a company, we have been exporting to the EU for more than 10 years. And accordingly, we have been certified by the respective body in the EU to do that. Secondly, the equipment which has been installed in our production lines, it's exactly the same as in the EU. We have the best samples of the world production as equipment. So in terms of all of that, we are also compliant. Therefore, I think that meat production, poultry production in particular, of all of the agrarian sector, perhaps is most prepared for accession. Why? Because the bulk of these companies, not only MHP, they have already been certified with the EU, so they are in full compliance with the contemporary requirements, and they're bracing themselves up for the changes that are upcoming. So I think that this sector usually, unfortunately, suffers from the greatest number of requirements from the EU, but on the other hand, will definitely be best prepared for the full-fledged assessment of our readiness. How important is it for MHP during this negotiation process to have this delay and concessions provided to in terms of safety, security measures, etc.? Well, this is a very specific question indeed, because I think that meat production and animal growing is not the full agrarian sector indeed, but there will be some things that will matter enormously during the negotiations. Requirements for the welfare of animals will be some of the key ones brought forward. But I think that the whole legal framework that complies with the requirements of the EU is already there in Ukraine. The first orders were issued 4 years ago. Therefore, the sector is aware of these requirements. We as the sector are working on their full implementation. The only thing that I can say ahead of time is that part of the producers that unfortunately are in a very close proximity to the front line. So they would definitely require some delay because they are suffering from the hostilities, and a lot of them are limited in terms of investment in order to introduce improvements to their way of production. So they definitely require some concessions during this transition period, at least for this share of the production facilities. I see. 3 regards concerning doing the homework that the government is to do, ensure most efficient negotiations process for Ukraine. It's hard to provide any advice to the government, but once again, in our case, it's to improve interaction with business, because business is looking forward to this interaction. On the one hand, we are ready to support the government, and on the other hand, we would like to make sure that the government officials need to understand our vision of getting integrated and accessed in terms of the requirements which are brought forward to us. So I speak about not only the agrarian sector as a whole, but also the agrarian sector under the auspices of the Federation of Employers of Ukraine. We have already prepared the full scope of the requirements, and we will be submitting that to the notice of the government. Our prospects concerning the future of the trade and economic relations with the EU, the adaptation to the requirements of the legislation of EU. I think that this work will be finalized by the end of this year, and this will present the full scope of the vision of the business concerning of what negotiations on behalf of Ukraine should be what commitments we are ready to undertake, and in what way we may be interesting for the EU. Thank you, Mr. Melnik, for a very positive attitude, quite positive perspective on things. Mr. Alexander, Mr. Vodovy, a representative of Metinvest Group. Your company is a huge producer. You are engaged in mining sector of Ukraine. Thousands of people work in there, and probably the challenge which your company is going through right now, in particular with Pokrovsk region, coal mining, and how much of production facilities have been lost. You seem to be one of the most affected companies, particularly DTEC company, which is part of your group. Metinvest, what are the biggest challenges that you see during the negotiations process, especially in terms of the environmental requirements? Because as we know it, the policy on the EU concerning the CBAM, carbon dioxide and monoxide emissions, they may be fraught with some difficulties for the Ukrainian businesses. So you have 4 minutes to answer that. Why are we willing to enter the EU? Why is it so sweet? Why is it so seductive for us? Because it is the most premium, the highest premium market. It's the sweetest and the fattest market, and we also want to get part of that market. This is a huge potential, a wonderful opportunity, fantastic experience to gain from, but it's also fraught with some dangers. Which ones? Getting back to the questions, the recommendations to the government for us to integrate into the EU properly and implement all of the legislation, etc. In part of the environmental protection, right now the trend that we are observing, there is a message that we are getting from the EU. There are a particular set of requirements that you need to approve, and that's all. But we cannot approve blindly all of these acts with reference to Ukraine. Why not? Because, for example, in Europe, to ensure decarbonization, on average, per every facility, about 500 to 1 billion euros are allocated. In our country, you understand, nothing is being allocated. So just blindly implementing all of these norms is definitely not an option. So our request is, please be mindful of this, pay attention to that, because our situation is drastically different from that of the EU. Now, why would the EU need us? I'm talking about ore in particular. We have very good deposits of coke, opportunities to make coke out of coal, and making ore out of the raw materials. So we can export that to the EU, and we need the EU as a sales market. So the assets that we would like to buy there in the EU will contribute to the development of our mining industry. Getting back to the environmental points, something else that I would stress is that when approving all of these acts of legislation, we may also stay overboard. We may unfortunately bury some of the industries that are the shapers of our GDP. Naturally, some other precautions that we have to be mindful of as we are moving on to the EU accession. Do our rivals in the EU want to see us there? Certainly not. But who is most reluctant to see us there? You will be very much surprised. Russians are not willing to see us there, because now 80% of our production is something that we compete in terms of competition with the Russians, not with the EU. All of the sanctions introduced, well, there was a part of sanctions that was effective. However, part of other sanctions was unfortunately rendered ineffective. For example, Russia still is pretty strong in some items. And the picture is as follows. If we have some manufacturing facilities in Italy, Italian producers, steel producers, they buy cheap semi-products from Russia. For certain reasons, we cannot procure that cheaply. Therefore, we lose to them in terms of competition. So in this respect, it's another thing that we would like the government to be mindful of. Of course, I don't have a ready-made solution, because I very well understand the Italian producers and European manufacturers. They also have their employees. But that's something that we are also faced with there in Italy. So what is the vision concerning CBAM? What is the negotiation strategy that you are to pursue? What do you insist on the delay, on implementing CBAM with reference to Ukraine, or delay plus certain investments on behalf of the company to upgrade some of the production manufacturing facilities? We always mind any kinds of benefits and preferences. No, we always say, provide us with the market, competitive market. We know how to compete. We are confident of ourselves. We can assert ourselves. Right now, unfortunately, it's not a competitive position. I will give you an example. Košice, they are provided with 600 million euros worth of different kinds of investments, and they say, so prepare yourselves with reference to CBAM and all of the other quotas. However, right now we are not provided with anything. That's why we are going to suffer lots of consequences and losses. So all of this story about CBAM is definitely not commercial. Grants are sorely needed for us. So the recommendation is we want to be on a par with the Europeans. Then, when being on a par, we are ready to compete. However, now, if the same requirements are brought forward against us in terms of environmental security, we'll definitely lose to Europeans. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Let me provide my reflection, and I would like to also ask a question, Ms. Katarina Maternova.
Metallurgy company saying that we don't want to have preferences, but we want to have access to the capital for investments and rebuilding the facilities in according to the ecological demands of EU, as some European producers have. One question to you, very quick, regarding facility plan. Whether facility plan envisage such possibilities, such financing for Ukrainian producers, just to be very key in the perspective of integration, European integration. Can they use this facility plan to modernize their facilities?
The Ukraine facility contains Pillar 2, and I'm looking at Lisa in the audience from IFC, one of our key partners. And Pillar 2 contains 8 billion euros for guarantees to both the private and public sector, with a preference to the private sector, for including things like decarbonization or various energy investment, access to finance, etc. So we work with our partner institutions, international financial institutions, national development banks, to do that. If you were to compare what is available to Ukraine compared to what's available to the member states, of course it's less, because the financing inside the EU is from a larger pot, but that's why the transition periods are there. So once you are inside the EU, you would be able to benefit from the larger flows of money. But in the meantime, in the preparation, I think the financing under the Ukraine facility is actually very generous.
Олександре, ви згодні з тим, що
Alexander, do you agree that the possibility to get finance within the Ukraine facility, where there is a huge component to guarantee the work with the Ukrainian companies with IFIs, that this can also become a tool to finance the upgrade and modernization of the Ukrainian metallurgical industry? In a way, I do agree with that, but in a way, I disagree. I will allow myself to disagree with Madam Ambassador. You see, the difference is they have a guarantee. It means that you have to enter the market, borrow the money, but you have to be guaranteed with the ministry within the framework of this facility. It's not the living money, but Europeans get the living factual money. Free, interest-free money, but our people are told, go make, take out loans from the banks, and you will be provided with the guarantees and security. This is a very impactful thing. Of course, this is a wonderful tool, and we definitely will not decline using such a tool. But nevertheless, this is not acting on a par. This is not the level playing field. Thank you. I understand that we could continue with this conversation, but time flies. Mr. Yevhen Osipov, you are also a chief executive officer of a huge agrarian enterprise kernel company. You grow oil crops and you produce oils, one of the greatest world exporters. My question perhaps may seem strange, not the environmental requirements, etc., but you know that the anti-monopoly legislation in the EU is rather stiff and rigid. And this substantial share of the market, this concentration of the Ukrainian agrarian holdings, have you regarded that from the perspective of risks for yourselves with reference to the commitments that Ukraine will assume in terms of the anti-monopoly legislation? And what is the strategy of your company with reference to that? Honestly, I suppose that the market of oil production in Ukraine is one of the best paragons of how a well-developed competitive market is developing and evolving. Yes, in terms of global production, we are a large producer, but in Ukraine, for instance, our share of sunflower oil production is about 22%. So we are working in a highly competitive market. And in order to raise our efficiency, we always invest in new technologies, making sure that it's not only our company, but our partners keep growing. Because when we understand what is an agrarian holding, it's a very virtual reality kind of thing. For this system to reach 22% on a sustainable basis, you have to ensure that your production is well certified according to all of the global standards. And in our case, that ensures about 10% of the raw materials that we need, plus the raw materials that we need to procure from the market. And in order to acquire that raw material, and in our case, this is sunflower, seeds and rape seeds, we have to invest in these producers, raise their level of digitalization. That's why we implement digital agribusiness, open agribusiness projects, a business that contribute not just to our company, but to the overall market. And my point is that the examples of the companies that exert such an influence on the market to develop them are just a few, very few indeed. A very good example to mention in this respect, something that Europeans can learn from us. It's something that Europeans can definitely learn from us, not only us from Europeans. From the standpoint of the European integration for kernel, is it a challenge or an opportunity? A European accession? Indubitably, it's both. Because as Serhiy has already said, this is a vitally important thing. You see, we are sure that we will be able to compete on a par with Europeans with reference to our efficiency, the approaches to doing business, the quality of products that we offer. We have 100% confidence that we can make it. But for us, it's also just as important to make sure that we enjoy level playing field. This is the work that our Cabinet of Ministers is engaged in together with all of the line ministries. I would like to extend my gratitude to everyone because I think that this work is being done at a very professional level.
And they are engaging us as businesses, so that we do it together. If you talk about fairness, and we maintain this fairness, then we'll be competitive also in Europe, because European buyers are already voting for us. They are buying MHP products, kernel products, other Ukrainian brands. So, yeah, we do have the opportunity to certify and be and sell on those markets. We can do it in the future. But in terms of Ukraine, we need to pinpoint one important thing. Yeah, Ukrainian market is interesting and it's quite big, but Ukraine itself is much bigger in terms of world food security. It's not only about providing for Europe. And when we will implement the European legislation, and Europe has to understand it, and we have to understand it, that we somewhere on average 25 to 30%, if we calculate all the products, can physically ship to EU. Because the market size won't allow to ship more, only in some separate articles of products. On 70%, we must be unified with those countries that are our stable importers. And this is what we have to resolve. In Europe, there is no other country where export part would be so big. So we can count on the level of support that Europe supports their agricultural producers, but we are not planning to only sell in Europe, and it's going to be a complex hybrid model. But we have to, through our ministry, we have to build it with the Europeans so that we improve food security and the quality of products inside Europe, and also facilitate food security for those countries that right now counting on Ukraine. Thank you. And that's exactly what Sergei said, that we have to look for alternatives, alternative markets, developing them. But we're talking about your integration. I must ask this question in the context of agriculture, absolutely. One of the most difficult elements of negotiations, all the new members went through it, and it's a shared agricultural policy of EU. It's a policy, it's a EU policy that has the biggest budget in EU. And the key spending in it is subventions to agriculture. So I'd like to ask you, and then Yuri Melnik, you are talking not only, so you're talking with the different partners, suppliers, competitors, etc. What will be the position of Ukrainian agriculture producers in terms of access to this European market? So it's going to be a battle between those who receive subventions, and the subventions now suddenly go to Ukraine. If you look at how they calculate it, how they provide it to different countries, even if we don't do anything, Ukraine will have to have a lot of these subventions. So what's the position of agricultural business? Can we compromise, or vice versa? We don't do anything to stall this negotiation. I'm not a participant in those meetings so that I can have an influence on this. In terms of us as a company, there are different models of agricultural producing. In Europe, use subventions. So if we look at Ukraine in terms of production, if Ukraine exports 30% all over Europe and the rest is in the world, Europe will not be able to keep the subvention model supporting 100% Ukrainian produce. It's not going to be logical. And that's how the products that have to go to Europe, that have to go to the single legal mechanism existing in EU, or to other markets, other rules. So it's a very hybrid process, very complicated. So I don't believe that it's possible. Do you need subventions when you will be members of EU? No, we didn't calculate the subventions because we don't think that businesses can be built on subventions. We have to be effective without subventions. If a part of our business will be so deeply integrated into Europe, and we'll have to deliver different norms and regulations, we have to have equal conditions with European producers. Subvention or no subvention doesn't mean equal conditions. So Europe will also initiate this kind of support. We see that some regulations have been postponed, etc. So we absolutely need equal conditions. Yeah, I support what Eugene said, because we also in understanding Europe, we are agricultural holding. So I'm not saying it's good or bad. So agricultural holdings, it's not all bad because they're doing good things. But in terms of subventions, I agree with Eugene, because the European agricultural policy itself is not constant. over the period that we are observing it, it's also evolving. The criteria change, amounts change, approaches change, and I don't believe that the whole Ukrainian agricultural sector can become a subvention-based business in this period. But since we have the structure of agricultural production is complex, there are small farmers and many of them, and they have to be they have to have access to European subventions. But that's a task for our government to calculate the sizes of the farms and other criteria, so that the farm can be then later eligible for European subventions. On the other hand, equal rights for businesses. Other than this, there are other businesses that Ukrainian companies can count on, and development in particular, because that's compensation of jobs created, production lines created, and so I don't think subvention-based businesses is something good or real. Thank you.
I think that both of you said it very correctly. I mean, the European Common Agricultural Policy is a policy that has developed from the very beginning of the EU, and it has been undergoing huge changes and transformations. And in fact, the prospect of Ukraine joining the more concrete it gets in terms of joining the EU will be another stimulus, another push to change the Common Agricultural Policy even more. So I think that there is indeed a role to support the small-holding farmers, etc. But I think that the past of the Common Agricultural Policy, when it was essentially subsidizing very, very large conglomerates, is something that is transforming. And as I said, Ukraine joining will be another push for further changes in it.
Great. The last question that I would like to ask you, because I wanted you to be the last, but anyway, you took the floor, and you're an economist, so you used to work in a banking sector, international IFIs for a long time, and you now work in Ukraine. You see the economy. In your opinion, what will be the most difficult question for negotiations for Ukrainian business regarding European integration? Obligations or something like this, but what will be the most difficult part?
I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer by training, but I think the most difficult will be the realization that in terms of the obligations, there is really no scope for saying it's, the term negotiation is a little bit a misnomer, because the word negotiation means a give and take. When it comes to the obligation of membership, there is no give and take. There is a set of obligations that need to be taken on board, and that's why I don't like the word negotiations, because they don't really capture what the process is about. And I think this will be difficult for Ukrainians to accept. But that's where the scope, as Ms. Trilko was saying, that's where the scope of the discussion is, the temporary periods, the transition periods, the support that Ukraine can get in meeting the obligations. But the accession to EU or different strands of the obligations that existed in the past are no longer the case. You have Denmark and Sweden that are not part of the euro, or you have some countries in the Schengen area, some not. That's no longer an option. All the new, and even including our, as recent as 20 years ago, accession to the EU was already with a full set of membership requirements. So, for example, Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary are not in the euro yet, but they have the obligation to get into the euro eventually. So I think this will be the most difficult to to accept the notion that once you are getting in, you have to take all the obligations on.
Thank you, Mrs. Ambassador. And і останнє питання, ми закриваємо дискусію сьогодні.
And the last question before we close the discussion, you heard what the Ukrainian businesses said, what the government said, and you heard what the ambassador said, that it's not going to be a negotiation. So negotiation is not the right word because it's taken commitments. So homework. How do we enter EU in the safest way for Ukraine? Well, first, you have to recognize and accept the fact that we're going there. And we have to have a strategy. Not for every small business, but for businesses, it's big. It's a big change, and they have to understand how they see themselves in 3 years. So what Catherine started and I started, that businesses have to understand what are the red lines that the government should understand. And the businesses should say, this is a big challenge for us. We are ready to do it after some time. So let's talk about transition period or additional support. And we're expecting from businesses, that we have an unprecedented opportunity for businesses to become the participants of this negotiation process. Monday there will be first meeting of interagency working group together with all the work groups. And so this inclusive process of negotiations will start to be implemented. So we encourage businesses to be so a short one on homework. So homework, we all have it, but we can only do it together. But I agree with the ambassador that you have to understand that this is really a commitment. Whether we want it or not, we have to deliver on the commitment. All the stakeholders will have to commit to that and deliver. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, speakers. Give a round of applause for a very interesting conversation. There wasn't enough time, but we wish Ukrainian businesses a support from governments. The government should listen to businesses and to protect the national interests, and our international partners should have understanding that Ukrainian economy, Ukrainian businesses are in unreally difficult circumstances. I think it should be an example for others, and Ukrainian businesses deserve to be heard, and at least in the negotiation process within our European integration, be approachable, and their voices should be taken into consideration. Thank you.